This podcast details true crime cases. It contains adult themes and may contain descriptions of violence. It is not intended for children. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for this special bonus episode of Once Upon a Crime. All of you who follow true crime cases probably have a handful, or at least a couple, that stay in your mind long after you learn about them. One true crime story I never forgot took place in Boston, Massachusetts in 1989. On October 23rd of that year, 29-year-old Charles Stuart placed a 911 call to report that he and his wife Carol had been carjacked, driven to a secluded section of the city, robbed, and shot. A citywide manhunt for the assailant began, but from the start, police were suspicious about Charles Stuart's story. Stuart was gravely wounded, but his wife, 7 months pregnant with their first child, died, as did their unborn baby. The series of events that unfolded afterward would captivate the city of Boston and the nation. A new podcast produced by the Boston Globe and presented in association with HBO MAX, titled Murder in Boston, revisits this true crime case and provides never-before-heard details of the crime, the perpetrator, and the havoc it wreaked on the city of Boston. Adrian Walker was a new reporter working for the Boston Globe at the time Charles Stuart's 911 call shook the city. It's a story that has resonated with him personally as a journalist and a citizen of Boston. He hosts the new podcast, Murder in Boston, and along with a team of Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporters, unveils explosive new findings that change the narrative of a story long cemented in the city's lore. So I am pleased now to welcome the host of Murder in Boston, Adrian Walker, to the show. Welcome, Adrian.
Thanks for having me.
This is one of those true crime stories from history that if you lived during that time, you probably remember it pretty vividly. I remembered it. As a matter of fact, when I got the invitation to interview you, I read like the first sentence or two, and I know exactly what this one is. I know exactly what this story is. I didn't remember the details, but it's one of those ones that stay with you. And this happened, like I said in the intro, in 1989. So I did give a brief summary in the intro. I wasn't sure if I should give any spoilers, so I'm going to leave that up to you. But if you can, will you tell listeners about the podcast Murder in Boston? There's quite a lot about this case, and there's also a lot of twists and turns in this story.
Well, Murder in Boston tells the story of the murder of a woman named Carol DeMady Stuart. She was murdered in Boston in October of 1989. She was coming from a birthing class at a big Boston hospital called Brigham and Women's. And the story that was told was that a black assailant had jumped in. She was with her husband, Chuck. They were a white suburban couple. The story that was told was that a black assailant had jumped into their car and shot them both. She died, he survived. And that turned out to not be what happened at all. It turned out that her husband was the assailant. He murdered her and shot himself. And Murder in Boston tells the story of how that happened, the search for this black assailant, how black neighborhoods in Boston were turned upside down over the next couple of months, leading to a pretty dramatic ending.
If I can get a little bit of background about you, how you got involved in this story, number one, how did it come to your attention? And then I guess the second part of that question would be, why did you decide to focus this podcast on this story like so many years later?
So in October of 1989, I was a new reporter at the Boston Globe. I had been at the Globe for 5 months when this story broke. And, it was such an explosive story in Boston at the time, because of the way it tapped into so many things, fears about crime and fears about, and racial tensions and all kinds of things like that, that it was a story that really stayed with people. It stayed with the people who lived it on the ground, and it stayed with the people who covered it as well, me included. Over the years, I went from being a reporter, I became a columnist, but it was a story I would revisit at every opportunity, as say when key members of people who figured in the story died or what other things happened or on anniversaries. And it was just a story that I stayed obsessed with. And, in the early days, relatively early in the pandemic in 2021, we had a team that was doing stories about police misconduct and so on in Boston. And we started thinking about the fact that there was a long history of this misconduct, and you could trace it in a way back to the Stuart case. And that was sort of the genesis of the podcast. That was where the idea for this project came from.
There's so much to talk about in this case. Of course, you have the crime story, which is already pretty shocking. And then you have the details of it and how it unfolds, which I think was surprising to a lot of people at the time, exactly how, like you said, how it ended up. But some of the elements in the story that I felt were really well detailed in the podcast were about the types of crimes and the elements of a crime story that received the most attention. It's like every decade they have a crime of the century, right? Depending on where you're at, right? So
Yes.
there's lots of things that go into that, like what the media picks up on, number one, right? Because that's where people are going to get their information, but also the public. What does the public kind of grasp onto? Like, what is it they pay attention to? And also, what kind of crimes do law enforcement put the most time and resources to, right? So how did all of that, just kind of in a snapshot, inform this story and how it was, I guess, initially when it first happened, how it was covered?
What all of us remember from covering it was that from the very beginning, it felt different. From the very beginning, it felt huge. And remember, this is at a time when there was a lot of crime in Boston. Boston was having record numbers of homicides. It wasn't unusual, sad to say, for people to get murdered. But this one tapped a nerve right away. You could feel it. And it was because, it was the whole aspect that she was 7 months pregnant. They were coming from this birthing class at a place where a lot of people had gotten their maternity care. There was the whole racial aspect of it, Black assailant, white couple, and all of that. There was the mayor of Boston the night of the shooting, before Charles Stuart had died, saying, we're going to put every available detective on this case. It was just like this outsized, huge explosion right from the beginning.
I mean, that makes sense. If you think about it, it's like, what do they say? It's always the husband kind of thing, But it's always, to me, it's like, if the woman is pregnant and the whole scenario of this where the couple both get shot, and yet she's the one that dies and the husband lives. Now, that's already a big clue.
Yeah, but what I always say about that, though, is that I think that in 1989, this idea that the husband always did it was less ingrained. This is pre-Nancy Grace. This is pre-crime TV.
Right.
There
you go. Yeah.
I don't think people thought about it. This is pre-OJ. And, I don't think people thought about it quite the same way. I mean, and to be sure, there are people, I talk to people who say, oh, my wife said right away the husband did it. But it wasn't the obvious assumption that it would be now.
Yeah, because I did pick up on that too in the podcast, that he was looked at pretty sympathetically, also because he was pretty badly injured, right?
Well, that was a big piece of it. Yes. I mean, when you talk to police and law enforcement people about why he wasn't pursued as a suspect more aggressively, the thing they'll always say is, look how badly wounded he was. You wouldn't think that if you were going to shoot yourself, you would almost kill. I mean, he almost killed himself. But to me, that just means he, didn't know what he was doing.
Right, exactly. That was the question I was going to ask, because of course we can't know because of the way that, that things end up, but we don't know a whole lot about him. So when you were, reporting on this story, it seems like there might have been like two sides, because on the one hand, like on paper, he looked great, right? He looked like just this, successful guy who's married and going to have a baby and, all of this. But there was also this kind of undercurrent to this shady side of him. So did that not come out until everything kind of was figured out, or was that something that you guys were picking up on as you were investigating this?
When we were investigating it, back in 89 and early 90, there was no hint of that. There was no hint of any tension between them. Nobody who knew them professed to have any clue of why things would have happened the way they did. And there wasn't really much sense that he was shady. I mean, it came out very late, post everything unraveling, that, he had been, chasing other women and thinking about getting separated and all of that. But nobody knew that at the time.
So what were the major elements of this story as you were looking at, say, back in 2020, 2021? What were the major elements of the story that you felt were the most important to present to listeners as they were going to be learning about this story, maybe for the first time?
The thing that really struck me was that it had been such a huge story in its time, but that even among people in Boston, it had been, almost forgotten. Three-quarters of the people in Boston didn't live here then, didn't live through it. And it was a chance to kind of unearth this history. And that was important. The fact that it still reverberates in the lives of the people who live through it. There are thousands of people you talk to who really, still carry this with them. And that was important too. I mean, to me, in a way, the true crime element of it was the least interesting part of it. Well, what I was more interested in was the ripple effect it's had in the city over 30 years.
Yeah, because that's what I was going to bring up next was I thought the podcast really highlighted in part the history and the politics of the city and what was going on in the city at the time and all of those things and how that played a part in this story. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Boston is a city that is notorious for having a long history of serious racial strife. And this crime really tapped into that. I mean, we go back to court-ordered busing in 1974, which became this huge, confrontation between Black and white neighborhoods, between places like South Boston, which are white, and Roxbury. There were kids on school buses, getting rocks thrown at them. There were, horrible things that happened. Black families moved out of predominantly white neighborhoods. And all of that tension, it led to 10 years of racial violence. And all of that was still in the air. And I believe it's part of the reason Chuck Stuart was so able to sell this story. There were a lot of white people in the city who were really willing to believe the worst, that, a Black person would jump into the car and do all of this stuff. And, and there is, sort of this whole backdrop to it.
If you think about the way that he said it occurred, it really didn't make any sense. I mean, yes, there was a lot of crimes, everything like that, but to jump in a car and have them drive you away and all this kind of thing. Of course, again, we're looking at it the lens now, people that are really very immersed into true crime cases and saying that doesn't make any sense. But of course, this was something that was, like you said, so many years ago. Because of the tension that was going on and everything that had happened, people just ran with that story.
What's interesting is that the first detectives who interviewed him, the first detectives on the case, immediately suspected him. They interviewed him in his hospital bed. They didn't think his story made any sense. They drove the route he'd gone. They didn't understand why he kept saying he didn't see anybody and couldn't get any help. There were just a lot of holes in the story. And I think law enforcement just ignored it and fixated on this narrative he'd sold.
So there were quite a few twists and turns in this case, the way it unfolded. Do you remember how you reacted because you were reporting on this as it happened in real time? Do you remember, was it shocking? I mean, do you remember how you reacted to, learning the truth about this case?
Well, I think we may as well say what happened, which is that on January 4th, 1990, after he had been exposed as the murderer, Chuck Stuart jumped off the Tobin Bridge here in Boston. And, I remember walking into the newsroom that morning in absolute shock. I mean, his brother had gone to the police the night before to kind of finger him as the murderer. And no, I didn't see that coming at all. I mean, it was a very odd investigation because, the murder happens in late October. There are two Black men over time who get identified as prime suspects, but they're never charged. It never seems like there's any real evidence against them. And so there were a lot of questions about what was going on, but gosh, the ending certainly took me by surprise, and I think it took most people by surprise.
What was the name of the gentleman who was the second person?
Willie Bennett.
Willie Bennett, yes. I knew that, they had this suspect, and I knew that, I think I recalled that he had somehow identified him as the shooter, but in the podcast this morning, I listened to this part where they have the audio of him talking about his identification of Willie Bennett. And I was my mouth just hung open. Like, this guy knows that this guy is completely innocent of this crime.
Right.
And yet he's so definitive about it. Like, oh, I remember his jawline. And, and I'm like, what a piece of crap. I mean, Yeah,
right. He picked him out of a lineup knowing that he did it.
Yeah,
it's stunning.
Exactly. It's stunning. Now, did he have information that this was who that they were zeroing in on? He had to have at some point. I mean, he had
You
to
would
have.
think so. We just don't know definitively. So many,
Mhm.
there's almost nobody who was in the room who's still alive. And
Mhm.
we don't know. But I assume he was coached.
I thought I was going to hear like him say, well, I'm not really sure. It could have been, that, I mean, if you have any shred of decency,
Yeah, but no, he was like, it was number
oh,
three.
we,
There's the
I was
guy,
like,
number
wow,
three.
I mean, not only did, he shoot his pregnant wife, but to pin somebody else, and just knowing that this guy is going to be, I mean, this is terrible. This guy could get I mean, who knows what could happen? Didn't have death penalty in Massachusetts at that time, did they? I don't think.
No,
I think they
but
were
yeah, but
talking about it.
yeah, he
But
was a true psychopath. He really was.
yeah, that was shocking to me. I'm like, wait a minute, let me listen to that again. What did he say? I
Even
don't
knowing
know.
as much as I knew about the story, to hear that tape, which of course we couldn't get back in like 1990, but to hear that tape when we got it was just jaw-dropping.
Oh God, yes, exactly.
Like
It's
so
the thing,
sinister.
yeah, very much so. There was a lot of details I didn't know or didn't remember about this case. I even got surprised a couple of times thinking, oh yeah, I forgot about that part. Did anything catch you by surprise? Because you were involved in it at the time that you had forgotten about, or that had like
Yeah,
this
and
had come to.
it wasn't something I'd forgotten about. I was very surprised, but to find out that 33 people knew that he'd done it. That was just staggering to me. Never would have guessed it was anywhere near that many.
I know that this is also tied to the documentary on it's on HBO, that there's video as well, because there was a television series or something that was video at the
Yes.
time that it happened, which is also another thing that you don't expect, correct?
Well, there was a show I remember it well called Rescue 911, and they used to go around the country and follow first responders around for a night. So that night, they happened to be in an ambulance in a Boston traveling with a Boston EMS unit, and they're with them when they get the call for the Stuart shooting, and they're right there at the scene, and they shot everything.
There's video of them, in the car. It's just, yeah, it's very chilling to see, all of that.
Yes.
But I didn't remember that. I really didn't remember that part for some reason. Maybe I blocked it because it's a little bit disturbing, but wow,
It is.
I mean, this guy pretty much did everything wrong. If you think did everything wrong, and even the stuff that you would never expect. And it's always surprising to me how they don't think that I don't think that they believe or even fathom that it's going to become such a big story, that it's going to be reported so widely, like it'll be, oh gosh, another terrible murder, we had the funeral, the end, right? And it didn't turn out that way at all for him.
There's this mythology that criminals are smart. They aren't necessarily. And the other thing about them is they can't keep their mouth shut. They all tell somebody who tells somebody who tells somebody.
Oh, this guy, how many people was he kind of trying to get him to help him? Even
he asked at least a couple of people to help him before the fact. And then after it happened, his brother knows, and his brother takes his girlfriend to breakfast and tells her, and she tells, people and so on.
Wow. It's a really compelling story. It's very bingeable, as the kids say these days. But I highly recommend listeners to check it out, because believe me, you will, if you haven't heard this story before, you haven't heard about this case, you will definitely be like, what? How come I didn't hear about this case? But even if you did, I feel like you have done such a great detailed and all the nuances of it as well, like just what was going on in the city at that time and pre to that time, and how it all kind of unfolded, and why it is an important story. I understand why it stayed with you, even when other things were happening over the years, because I feel like it's a really important story for people to not even just know, but to understand. And I think that's what this podcast does very well, is it really explains all of that from different perspectives that I think help us to kind of grasp what a big story it was.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know whose idea this was to interview the hairdresser, the guy that was his hairdresser.
Yes.
That is so genius, because think about it. Hairdressers know everything, right?
They really do.
They don't even just the gossip, but I really feel like they have this insight into human nature because they deal with so many people. And this guy really had a peg on Charles Stuart and said, yeah, this guy I was I got pissed off. Like, what the hell? Like, dude, like I was trying to be pathetic. You're just over here like, can you cover my gray? I'm like, and he was a great interview. So whose idea was that, or how did you even know to interview the hairdresser?
I'm not sure how we found the hairdresser. I believe he had spoken to the grand jury. I think he was called in front of the grand jury for some reason. And that's how we got to Will Zacco. But he is definitely one of the most colorful characters in the podcast. Glad we talked to him.
Very well spoken. He really had insight into and that was one of the things I was kind of looking for in the podcast, because I didn't think we couldn't get a lot about Charles Stuart because he didn't go through a trial and all of this kind of stuff where we could see what is he going to say, what is his, his story or his motivation or his defense or whatever. We didn't get any of that. So I always want to try to find out a little bit more about the perpetrator. What could we know? So this was one way, the people around him, of course. And this guy is being like a neutral observer. But now I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to start talking to hairdressers and see. They must have stories about these people. They have to.
Hairdressers know everything.
They do. Yeah, shout out to all the hairdressers out there, man. And yeah, you definitely. If you have any juicy stuff, let us know. Okay, reach out. So tell us where people can find Murder in Boston, where they can listen. And I will also put up any links that you want to share in the show notes as well.
Yeah, you can find it anywhere you get podcasts. It's Murder in Boston. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on Spotify. It's everywhere.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian. It was so nice talking to you. This is definitely, one of the podcasts I think people really should make sure that they listen to this year for sure. And good luck with everything going forward.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Adrian Walker, for being on today's show. You can listen to the Murder in Boston podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere you get your podcasts. You can also watch the documentary series on HBO MAX. I've included links in the show notes. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. CrimeCon 24 in Nashville, Tennessee is coming up soon. Make sure to secure your tickets and stop by Podcast Road to meet me from May 31st to June 2nd. Go to crimecon.com to register and use my discount code ONCE to get 10% off your registration. And I'll see you in Nashville. Until next time, be good to one another.